The expert presenter for today's discussion is Dr. Anne Bainbridge Frymier, Professor of Communication and Associate Dean of the Graduate School at Miami University. At this time, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Frymier.
Hi, this is Anne Frymier. Thank you for logging on to this webinar and to learn a little bit more about teaching persuasion. I'm assuming that all of you are either currently teaching persuasion or have been asked to teach persuasion or considering it. And so you might be thinking about, well, why should we teach persuasion? And you may be asked that question at times. There's actually a lot of reasons to teach persuasion. For most of us, if we're teaching in communication types departments, we have students who are majoring in communication or related disciplines who are pursuing careers such as in public relations, strategic communication, corporate communication, sales, legal affairs, and many of our students may be planning to go on to law school or things like that. So they're seeking careers and positions where they're going to be expected to be effective communicators and to know how to influence others, whether that be inside their workplace internally or externally, or with specific clients, particularly like in sales. And so persuasion is a central part of those career expectations. Beyond those specific careers, leadership, being an effective leader, involves persuasion. Workplace communication involves persuasion. So persuasion is really a central part of work life. Beyond the workplace, persuasion is a very important part of society. It's omnipresent. You might initially think of advertising because we're such an advertising saturated society, but persuasion goes well beyond advertising and political communication to, obviously we've talked about workplace and interpersonal relationships, both from family and outside of family. So persuasion occurs in all contexts, across all relationships, both in mediated and unmediated forms of communication. And persuasion is really a core element of communication competence. So teaching persuasion is relevant for our students professionally, really regardless of what careers they're pursuing, and it's relevant to their life and their ability to function effectively in their families, with their friends, and across society. So there are a lot of reasons to teach persuasion, and I think that's one reason why persuasion's become a more commonly taught course than it was when I first started teaching it back in the 90s. When you're thinking about teaching persuasion, there's a number of different approaches you can take. There's not one right way of teaching it or one version of it. One early on decision to make when you're approaching persuasion is whether to take a rhetorical approach or a social science approach. And these two can be mixed, and there's probably some people who can successfully weave them together into both. But they really are two different approaches, and there's a lot to each approach. I've personally always taken a social science approach that's just more consistent with my preferences and background. And most textbooks out there either take a rhetorical approach or a social science approach. So it can be hard to weave those together. So beyond that, then there's other approaches you can take. Students often come to persuasion wanting a very practice-oriented class. They are familiar with persuasion and usually kind of a limited stance, and they often want the 5 ways in which you can persuade somebody. They often believe that if they just know how to make that specific argument, or they have that specific skill, or know the secret password, that they'll be able to influence anyone, anytime, any place, kind of thing. And that's, of course, very unrealistic, although you can certainly find websites that make those kinds of promises. But students often, they want to know how. They want the recipe. Faculty, on the other hand, often want a more theory-oriented approach. As faculty, we often recognize the value in theory. We recognize that explaining why and how is often far more useful than just being given a recipe for how to do it. And then my experience early on was that students often resisted the theory-oriented. Students often have difficulty finding the relevance in theory and may get bored with learning one theory after another. Related to a theory-oriented approach is the research-oriented approach, which is probably most common in graduate level education, where the focus is really on the different research studies and how the theories were developed through research and so forth. And undergraduates often don't have the background or interest to be able to really hold on to a very highly research-oriented approach to teaching it. My approach has always been, from early on, was to integrate the theory, research, and practice. So my belief is that these three things are really like three legs on a stool, in that if any one of them is missing, it gets wobbly and you kind of fall off and things don't go so well. As I mentioned, students want practice. They want to see that, and the theory is useful in explaining the practice. So practice helps students see the relevance of the theory and can help explain that. The theory is really kind of pointless if it can't help us better understand practice. So the theory is useful it can be made more concrete by using it to explain practice. Research I always see as being the connective tissue, because research is how the theory is developed, but research is also how we evaluate and test practice and whether or not it works or not. And so I see these three things as being really three parts of the whole, and they all kind of synergistically help explain and make each other relevant. Now, I don't put equal emphasis on these three things when I teach. I tend to put more emphasis on the theory, but then use lots of the practice, lots of examples, and then use the research to kind of explain things and help them better understand what makes the theory, how the theory developed, as well as helping them to be able to evaluate the theory in terms of how good of a theory is it. So there's different approaches. And personally, I like integrating the three, and I've gotten pretty good response from students that they find this more interesting. They have typically walk away with a much more of appreciation for theory and understanding its uses and its relevance. Now, we're talking about teaching persuasion. There are often a number of challenges that people experience. And I certainly experienced some significant challenges when I first started teaching persuasion, when I first came to Miami, after being a brand new professor. So one of the challenges that I think many of us encounter, and not just in persuasion, but a variety of courses, is getting students to read the textbook. When I first started teaching persuasion, the textbooks available were pretty theory-oriented and pretty dense in that sense. Very good content, but getting students to read them was an ongoing challenge. Really hard to get them to stick with it. Another challenge that is common is that students have preconceived notions of persuasion. They have been living it and breathing it, and especially with social media, they often walk in the door feeling like they know what persuasion is. They just want to know how to do it more effectively. And so there's a lot of unlearning that I find that have to help students identify that their assumptions, the things that they think are just true, and they don't know why, but then often they're not true. And so that's something that sometimes I have to kind of go down below the surface to help them understand what they think is true isn't necessarily true, and get beyond that. And then application of theory. So because I integrate theory, research, and practice, I have students do a lot of application of theory. And this is something that my experience has been that students don't have a lot of experience with. They want to apply it, but they don't really understand how to do it. And they need help. It's hard, and they need help doing it. And so that's always been a challenge. And then the fourth thing are ethics. When I first started teaching persuasion, none of the textbooks dealt with ethics. It was just kind of, they laid out these persuasive tools, and I felt like I was giving students a hammer that they could use to do good things, or that they could use to bash somebody over the head. And it made me rather uncomfortable at times that, or that something was missing. And when I started pulling ethics into the teaching, I felt much more comfortable with it. And students also, I think, developed an more appreciation or more in-depth understanding of persuasion and really what was involved with that. So these are some common challenges, and if you have other challenges, please text those in to Ryan, and we can talk more about those there as we get to the question and answer session. So how I dealt with these challenges, well, these challenges were my primary reason for wanting to write a textbook on persuasion, because I didn't feel there were any of the textbooks that really dealt with these things that I wanted to deal with. And so, my solutions to these problems were in really taking a very learning-oriented approach. So my background, my doctoral training is in instruction as well as communication. And so I think about teaching as well as communication research and so forth, very much from a learning theory of Bloom's taxonomy, and I use the key terms, review questions, and so forth to help students recall and comprehend the information, those lower levels, but then use the theory, application, the integration to really build the application, to get students to apply the content at higher level of learning, to be able to analyze a persuasive message, as well as the creation of being able to create persuasive messages. In the textbook that I wrote, because application analysis are very important to me, I really tried to create a book that was supported application, where the theories were applied and examples were given that would set the foundation, so that as the instructor I could bring in other things, bring in other examples. Students could bring in examples. I often have students bring in examples and then analyze those, talk about those, and relate them to specific theories to help bring alive to do that integration of theory and application. I also really tried to make a book that was student friendly, that students would read, because there was no point in it if they weren't going to read it. And as I mentioned earlier, my earlier frustrations was that they often didn't read early on. And then the final solution I created for my problems was creating an ethics chapter in the textbook and bringing that in. Now, I always approach it is that that's kind of the last thing I do. I talk about ethics here and there. It's kind of integrated throughout the chapters, and there's different ethical questions that are brought up. But I don't really tackle ethics until the end. I tried doing it at the beginning of the semester one time, and I'm sure that would work wonderful for some people. But for myself, I found that students really weren't ready to tackle ethics until they really had a strong understanding of what persuasion was and what all the different tactics were that you could use in persuasion. And so at that point, so I tend to do it it's almost like a mini capstone to the course, where we talk about different ethical perspectives, and I push them to think about what are the ethical issues, questions, and how different perspectives give us different answers. And it's a little frustrating for some students at times because there is no correct answer, but it does get them thinking quite a bit about what's going on with that. So,
Anne?
yes.
I do have a challenge that one of our viewers is experiencing, and I want to share it with you. They're having difficulty with students doing an in-depth analysis. Do you have any solutions for that particular topic?
And so, I think I understand. I have that same problem at times because they don't, I'm guessing what the problem is, that they do very surface analysis and then and don't get at some of the bigger issues. So how I've try to deal with that. And this is a kind of an ongoing challenge. And sometimes things work better than others. The more analysis I do in class, the better their papers are. In terms of their doing like an analysis paper where I give them a message to analyze. And what I mean by that is that we bring stuff in and we kind of do it together. My experience, and Miami students are pretty bright students. Miami's a pretty selective institution, so I feel like we've got some pretty good students and they still really struggle with this. That they often have not really been asked to really analyze things with much depth in the past. And so they just don't really know how to go that extra level. And so I do it in class, and I do some do a number of group activities in preparation for it too, where they have to work as a group to analyze things and discuss it. One thing I've done with the assignments that sometimes helps is I have, like for an analysis assignment, it's almost like a 2 or 3 part assignment where initially they have to choose I might have them choose an organization. And maybe and sometimes I often make it has to be a nonprofit organization that's promoting some behavior kind of thing. So it's like environmental organization, or it could be a health kind of organization. And have them do an initial brief paper just on describing what the messages are that they use, what their persuasive goals are, who their audience is, and to give them some opportunity to really kind of dive into, well, what's this organization about? What kinds of things are they trying to get people to do or to stop doing? And then I have them take, for the second assignment, I have them take one or more of the messages that organization uses and analyze that. And that seems to work a little bit better because they have a better understanding of the what in terms of the content of the persuasive message. And for some reason, then that seems to help them be able to do a little bit more in terms of the analysis of the actual persuasive strategies. So that's how I've handled it. But analysis, getting students to do in-depth analysis is a challenge. Are there any other questions that have come up, Brian?
Yeah, there's a few. Do you want to hold off until the end, or certainly it's up to you?
Well, I think we are kind of approaching that point. I was going to bring up say a couple things about the upcoming 5th edition, which isn't coming out right away. It's going to be a little bit in terms of, in addition to updating all the chapters, I've included a little bit more of a discussion of implicit attitudes, which has gotten more press in the last year or two, and more emphasis on resistance to persuasion, how receivers are resistant to persuasion. And then I'm planning to do a new chapter on deception, which just seems kind of timely in this after the past couple of years in terms of deception. I'm not going to really use the word fake news, but that certainly, I'm sure students will bring that up as we talk about that. But otherwise, yeah, let's talk about some questions.
Well, I'm excited about the deception chapter. I just got a question from an actual user of the book. He loves the book, by the way. He understands that you don't use a rhetorical perspective, but have you considered addressing propaganda and distinguishing it from persuasion in your ethics chapter? Well,
I do I talk about propaganda in the chapter that precedes I think it's chapter 12. So the question is, including the propaganda in the ethics chapter more specifically? I have not really thought about that. I think there are some linkages from the ethics chapter back into to propaganda. So it's a question, as I thought about integrating the propaganda content into ethics?
Yes, that's what I take from it, yes.
Well, that's certainly something that I'll keep in mind as I revise the ethics chapter. I haven't tackled the ethics chapter yet in my revisions. but there's certainly lots to talk about. When you're talking about propaganda, there's certainly a lot of ethical issues that come up. Actually, because I have the talk about propaganda when I teach the class right before I teach ethics, it's almost like a launching pad to talk about ethics.
What's the students' reaction been to your approach with this fusion of theory and practice? How have the students responded?
I would pretty positively. So the frustrations that students tend to have is that theory can be kind of difficult to understand. Some of the theories are kind of complex, and they need to, that you can't just memorize them. Students, have been, I think almost more so than ever before, have been trained to memorize in their earlier education, and you can't memorize the theory and be able to apply it. And so when they get frustrated because they try memorizing it, and they're bright, they work hard, but they're memorizing, and then when they try to apply that, it just doesn't work. And so the thing I've learned and work on more is trying to get them to understand that I did a little bit different approach to learning. And actually, I've been doing kind of almost like little tiny mini lectures about learning theory and how the brain learns in the last couple of years, trying to get students to study differently in terms of linking content together and seeing how things are related to one another rather than trying to memorize it. Because until they see how everything links together and how the theory is an explanation for a phenomena that we observe, they really struggle with the application. That's also what makes the analysis difficult. So when students get past that, when they make that leap, and when they do, it's really fun for me to watch that because it's a huge leap in their development. But the downside is that not every single student makes that leap, either because of a lack of their own motivation or just they don't quite get it yet. So when they get it, they like it because they often walk in the door with kind of a negative view of theory, that theory is just a bunch of ivory tower stuff that hasn't had any relevance to real life. And so when they start seeing that theories an explanation for how things work in life and how a good theory gives us guidance in how to do things and how to practice, and gives us guidance on how to make a decision of how to frame a persuasive message or and so forth, that they appreciate that, they get it, but it takes a little bit to get them there.
Great. Another challenge is incorporating guest speakers. Do you personally incorporate guest speakers when you teach? And also, do you have any examples that others could use?
I have not used guest speakers a great deal. And not because I don't think you should, it's just, I guess there's so much that I have so many activities and so much stuff I want to do in class with the students that it just seems like it's hard to fit a guest speaker in as well, because that takes up pretty much a whole class period. When I have used guest speakers, I've primarily used alumni of our program who are in positions of like in public relations or something, a career where it's very related to persuasion. And that has worked pretty well. I think it depends on kind of how you're approaching the class. If you're approaching the class from a more practice-oriented, what they're going to be doing in the workplace, then guest speakers are probably really, really useful because it gives that, this is the kind of examples of what you might be doing. Since I tend to put more emphasis on the theory, it's harder to get a connection, helps for the guest speakers to present things that are really going to help students understand how to apply the theory to the practice. I think it depends a little bit on, or a great deal on, what's your emphasis on what you're trying to accomplish. I spend so much time working on them to get them to apply the theory that I don't doesn't leave me a lot of time for guest speakers. And so if you really want, you can't do it all, and that's like probably one of the other challenges, but there's really no solution for that. There's only so many hours, so many days in a semester, only so much that students can do, and the more I go, I end up doing a little less and trying to do less in terms of covering content and doing more and getting them to use the contents and interact with the content, which ends up being usually for me passing on the guest speakers.
Makes complete sense. You can only fit so much in a day. You're right. And feel free to keep those questions coming. Here's a question from a Facebook viewer. Okay. You had mentioned the organizational analysis activity. What are some other activities that you suggest incorporating into courses? Okay.
I do use a lot of activities. Some of them are quite small. A lot of them are more application oriented, and in the instructor's manual, there are, for each chapter in the textbook, there are activities. And so when I'm doing the first part of the book, or really it's the second part of the book, where we look at persuasion from a communication standpoint of source factors, message factors, receiver, and channel factors, I have students bring in a lot of examples, and I look for examples constantly too. And so, in fact, I'm teaching persuasion this semester. Before this, I was prepping for my class tomorrow, and we're starting the chapter on message factors. And so I'm going through the newspapers looking for, we're going to focus on evidence, so like editorials, opinion pieces, where they use evidence. And so I'm going to have them basically analyze that, looking for examples where narrative evidence and statistical evidence are used, and we'll talk about that. So that'll be an activity that'll probably take some time. I have students working in groups a lot, particularly this semester, and I really like to give them, so for example, yesterday in class, we were talking about source credibility, and particularly how with the expectations for the source are incongruous, then that can enhance credibility. So I gave them a scenario of who should be a spokesperson for an anti-abortion organization, and gave them 5 different people. In each group, they had to choose their which one they thought it was and why, and of the 5 people. And they were all credible, could be potentially credible people. So they argued amongst themselves in order to come up with who they thought was best. And then they all had to share their answer at the same time. And then we talked about each one, what the advantages or disadvantages for each person might be as being a credible spokesperson for that organization. So those are I do a lot of activities. They're like that. Some of them may take 5-10 minutes. Some of them may take 20-25 minutes. In the Theory of Reasoned Action chapter, there's an activity I've done for a number of years that is very specific in that it gives them it's almost like a case study where it gives a particular person's attitudes and beliefs, and they have to calculate out the attitudes and beliefs using the formulas that are in the textbook, they're part of Theory of Reasoned Action. And so they have to apply all those formulas, which is very specific, and then from that figure out a persuasive message using the strategies of Theory of Reasoned Action, which is it's a little bit more involved kind of activity, a little bit more specific. And that one is one of my favorite activities. I always do it because students tend to have difficulty with Theory of Reasoned Action, and after doing that activity, the light bulb goes off. All of a sudden they see how those formulas can be used and actually apply to real life kinds of persuasion.
That's great. Outstanding activities. Thank you for sharing that. And I know you had mentioned too, I think you had mentioned an instructor's manual. How hard is it to switch to this approach using this package?
I would think it's be relatively easy. The book is set in that, so the instructor's manual has your standard kinds of things of outlines, PowerPoints, test bank, and then as I mentioned, it has activities for each unit. It has film clip suggestions for each chapter. And the book integrates theory, research, and practice. And so I tend to use a more theory-oriented approach to this. And the textbook has all of that information. Each theory that's talked about is talked about in depth. But it's not just theory in terms of there's 4 or 5 major theories talked about. We also have the chapters that are communication focused, the source, the receiver, source, message, receiver, and channel, which is less theory oriented. It's more, these are the findings, these are the effects of messages, these are the source effects, persuasion, which is a little bit more practice oriented. And then, of course, there's ethics at in the chapter as well. And then research studies are described. And it's more of a, but not a huge number of research studies. So this book can be used in some with different approaches. It's not going to work well for a rhetorical approach. It works well for a social science approach. That's where it's at. But you can use this book to drive home theory, because you can add, well, there's some of the other readings that are more in depth on the theories. You can use this, supplement it with research studies if you want students to get more into the research. And I've talked to people who've used this textbook at the graduate level, where it's almost more of a supplement, where this gave students the background on the theories, and then their primary reading was on research with the different research studies. And then you can also use it focused with more practice. You're bringing in more examples of practice and having students spend a lot of time constructing messages, where the textbook then serves as kind of a guide for what some of the principles of persuasion are. So the chapter on ethics, well, it's the last chapter in the book. It's written such that it could be one of the first chapters presented in a class. You could have students read that early on if you want to really have a discussion about the ethics of every aspect of persuasion as you went through it. So it's I think the textbook is flexible enough that it will accommodate different approaches to teaching persuasion, which makes it easier to adopt and to use. And depending on if you've never taught persuasion before, the instructor's manual has the outlines and so forth, which can help you get your lecture notes and so forth together. But it's also got the activities, so you're not starting from scratch in that regard. So I think it's relatively easy to adopt.
Great, thank you so much. That's all the questions I've received. So
Okay.
Thank you so much. Attendees, you will be getting a recording of this webinar, so you can view it offline as well. In addition, I'll be sending Anne's email address, so if you have any questions directly for her, I'm sure she's offered to help answer any questions personally as well. So anything else, Anne?
No, those of you who if those of you who have already adopted my book, thank you. I appreciate that, and I'm always looking for feedback on the textbook and what works and what might not work, and if there's things in the textbook that you don't use, or there's chapters or parts of chapters that you just don't even use, and that you think could be dropped, I would be interested in hearing that. Or if there's areas that you think that aren't covered sufficiently enough and you'd like to see more content on, that's really helpful information as I'm working through the revisions and tweaking chapters and adding and taking things away. I try not to just to add. I try not to add something unless I either take something away or reduce it down so the book doesn't, I don't want the book to get too long. So thank you. I look forward to hearing from any of you if you have questions.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure working with you, and I know all the attendees can walk out of here with some exercises and activities that they can incorporate tomorrow. So thank you so much. Have a great day, all.